The Australian political landscape, compared to the average state of affairs around the world, is one of relative sanity and serenity. Much was made of then Prime Minister Scott Morrison's comments about the March for Justice rally, that the protesters should note that,
"Not far from here, such marches, even now, are being met with bullets."
While his message was tactless and ill-timed, he wasn't wrong. In Myanmar just the month before, a military junta that was violently suppressing opposition had come to power. In Papua New Guinea a year later, more than 50 people were killed in trying to cast their vote at the elections of that year. Passions may run high from time to time, but the idea of a coup is a wild fantasy in Australia. Perhaps the most famous incident of violence involving Australian politics is the attempted assassination of Arthur Calwell in 1966, which I've covered before. Far less well known is perhaps the most irredeemable character in Australian political history, former Minister for Justice of New South Wales, Thomas Leigh. Thomas John Leigh was born on the 28th of October 1880 in the city of Bath in the United Kingdom. Leigh spoke little of his origins, as he, as a Conservative politician, attempted to portray an air of superiority. In truth, he was of unremarkable birth. His father died at work when Leigh was not yet 2 years old. He and his 3 siblings were raised by their mother, who took the family from Bath to Glebe, Sydney, in 1886. His mother ran a boarding house, and Leigh worked delivering papers, but a career in delivery did not await Leigh. He observed the opulence of the nearby Hereford House, and desired it. Logically, he made himself known to one of the occupants of Hereford House, Judge William Wilkinson, who took Leigh under his wing. While working on a farm in Windsor, Leigh practiced his shorthand by writing out speeches from the New South Wales Legislative Assembly. Judge Wilkinson gave a reference which helped Leigh find his entry into the law, working under a solicitor. This starting point led him to a larger firm in 1901, and Leigh became a solicitor himself in 1914. Leigh's aim was the Legislative Assembly, as he had been following the activities of prominent free trader Sir Henry Parkes, whose beginnings were, like Leigh's, humble. The defeat of Parkes' government by Labour crossbenchers ignited a Toryism in Leigh which would last all his life. Biographer Dan Morgan proposed that he wanted no narrowing of the gap between the have-nots and the haves, despite originating from the former group. Aged 17, though giving his age as 21, Leigh married Emily Louise Vernon, whose name Leigh would contort into the alternatively spelled Louise Leigh. They had met while working at the same solicitor's office in Pitt Street, Sydney. Louise was from a well-heeled family, and though her father had died in Somerset, as Leigh's had, her father was a doctor, and she and her family were well provided for, in fact living across the street from Hereford House, which had so captivated a young Leigh. The lie about his age enabled him to furnish himself with the Vernon estate. A neighbour of the pair noted that Leigh was so incredibly vain it would have galled him to know that his wife had confided in her friends that his in-laws had given him his first taste of affluence. All politicians had to start somewhere. Unfortunately for Leigh, Glebe had emerged as a Labour stronghold, and his views would be electorally ineffective. Leigh moved to the relatively undeveloped Hurstville, in the St George area of South Sydney. In an example of parachuting that would make Christina Keneally blush, Leigh stood for local council after 5 months in Hurstville. Unlike Keneally, Leigh was successful, based on his effective pandering to the overwhelming Protestant majority of Hurstville, and total disregard for the Irish Catholic minority, which he referred to as bog trotters. He nominated immediately to become mayor of Hurstville. His rise and arrogance irritated other councillors, and he was defeated. Ever gracious in defeat, Leigh committed to making the new mayor's term a misery. He harried the mayor with nitpicking points of order and disputed his rulings with hair-splitting legalisms. He would try again to become mayor in 1908, 1909 and 1910, his disrepute within the council bringing him unsuccess each time. Mark Gosling MLA, a contemporary of Leigh, said that Hurstville in the early 1900s fixed 3 basic requirements for its political hopefuls. These were that they were churchgoers, Masons, and temperance advocates. Whether the latter of the 3 was a genuine element of Leigh's belief system, or if it was simply absorbed as a part of the shape-shifting that any effective politician will do, is unknown. Leigh did, however, embrace the issue with vigour. A tenured debater, he was also a rabid and articulate prohibitionist. The nickname Lemonade Leigh is often applied to him for his habit of only drinking lemonade at events, though it is wondered whether he invented it for himself or not. The influence of the temperance movement in Hurstville helped Leigh in his political career. As a councillor, Leigh campaigned with vigour against the licentiousness of Sydneysiders. citing incidents on New Year's Eve 1907 of men interfering with women in the full illumination of the electric lights in the colonnade of the General Post Office, despite no complaints being received by the police. Other crusades which Leigh ventured upon included seeking convictions for boys who rode their bicycles on footpaths and beer-sodden louts who had been shouting obscenities at girls by Hurstville railway station. Once again, little evidence of this actually occurring could be found, but signs warning of fines for such behaviour were built, and police were instructed to enforce them. Leigh also offered his legal services to the council at no charge. Fellow councillor Leslie Blackshaw recalled an evening at Leigh's house, drafting documents for the council when Leigh's sons entered timidly to say goodnight. At his insistence, they called him pater, a Latin term that seemed pretentious even in those far-off Edwardian times. Leigh also joined the Presbyterian Debating Society. In no time at all, he had become its president, brought it into line with Sir Erskine May's book on parliamentary practice, renamed it to the Hurstville Parliamentary Debating Society, and used it to hone his debating skills, in addition to being a tool of his own political promotion. Leigh, the publicity officer, simply by quoting Leigh, the president, got his name into the first paragraph of the news releases he prepared each week for the local newspaper, the Hurstville Propeller. After 4 unsuccessful attempts at the mayoralty, Leigh had had enough. He wanted to quit in 1910, but stayed on for the last year of his term in order to not appear a sore loser. His last year on the council was an unproductive one, where he participated rarely, except to snigger at any malapropism or grammatical blunder by the members who had thwarted his mayoral ambitions. The area of Hurstville was encompassed at that time in the state seat of Canterbury. The seat was held by Conservative Varney Parkes, son of Sir Henry Parkes. The parliamentary skill of Sir Henry was not hereditary, it seemed, as the young Parkes would often neglect his constituency, carrying on as an MLA from his father's reputation alone. A redistribution which split his seat in two saw him defeated in the new seat of Hurstville in 1913 by the Labour candidate, and Parkes announced he would not seek pre-selection at the next election. Leigh, who had laid into Parkes while he was on the council, sought the nomination for the next election as the Liberal candidate for Hurstville. The changing shape of Hurstville as an electorate meant that it included more than just Hurstville, and a prominent opponent in the form of Edward Hindman appeared, a local of the Sutherland Shire, which was also included in the electoral district. Leigh took the fight straight to Hindman, moving from Hurstville to Sutherland, hoping to erode Hindman's support while maintaining his own in Hurstville. Wasting no time, Leigh became president of the Sutherland Schools Parents and Citizens Association within a fortnight, and he would rotate his appearances at the various churches of the area on Sundays. The result of the 1916 Liberal pre-selection for Hurstville was a majority for Leigh in the first round of voting. When the Great War broke out, Leigh uncontroversially supported the war effort, raised funds, and towards the war's end, helped with repatriation and commemoration, though he had no interest in joining up himself. The 1916 split in the Labour Party gave Leigh the chance to unseat the sitting Labour MP, who interpreted the failure of the conscription referendum as support for the Labour Party. The Labour split was not all upsides for Leigh, who had to reprint his election material after a leadership and party name change, and the new leader of the Nationalist Party was former Labour leader William Holman, whom Leigh had previously referred to as a socialistic incompetent. Leigh, in addition to his teetotaling, had that other most fatal of un-Australian flaws. He did not care for sport. This was seen as an electoral vulnerability, so Leslie Blackshaw, who was on the Hurstville Council with Leigh, advised Leigh on all matters of bat and ball, and would prompt Leigh when asked about the improvement of recreation facilities. Mercifully for Leigh, there was a war on, so questions of his top 10 cricketers remained unasked. He suggested MPs' wages be cut by £200, and that the money should be directed to the war effort, which his Labour opponent Samuel Toombs rejected, at an electoral price immeasurable in pounds. Leigh would later say in the Legislative Assembly that if members were paid according to their merits, they would be receiving £1,000 rather than £500 a year. On the day of the election, things were looking good for Leigh. He had one last rally to attend, when his car failed to start. Across the street, a funeral director offered to help out, and Leigh played the inconvenience into his rightfully confident messaging. Leigh arrived in a hearse and declared, "We have come to bury Labour's hopes. We are here to entomb Toombs." The landslide victory of the Nationalists carried Leigh to victory, though Leigh recorded a fine swing of 10%, indicating that it was not all luck that had got him there. Leigh's parliamentary skill was well honed from spending his formative years watching debates in Parliament, studying Sir Erskine May's Guide to Parliamentary Practice, and participating in debates himself at the School of Arts Debating Society. whose alumni included Sir Henry Parkes, George Read and Edmund Barton. Ley would often provide debating tips to his fellow parliamentarians, even those on the other side of the chamber. Labour MLA Walter Skelton declared that he had Ley to thank for scores of useful debating hints. Upon arrival in Parliament, one of his first duties was to head out and promote the second conscription referendum in rural areas. A story was recalled by Labour MP James McGurr in Parliament several years later of an incident in Cootamundra, where Ley is said to have left a conscription rally before coming face to face with a crowd of anti-conscriptionists. Ley exchanged barbs with the crowd, who called him a hypocrite for his lack of military service, and an altercation began, leaving Ley bleeding from a cut to the ear and a cripple knocked down, some say by Ley. McGurr warned of a sinister motive in Ley's character. Many men of perhaps criminal type have learnt to hide what is in them. It is lying dormant, and sooner or later must come to the surface. The cries of hypocrisy from the crowd were said to have originated from Frederick Legg, a Labour official whom Ley would get revenge on years later by dismissing him from his position as an honorary licensed magistrate in Cootamundra. Ley denied responsibility for the decision, and denied even knowing Legg. Though Premier Holman spoke at rallies for Ley in 1917, the relationship between the two did not improve. The Labour Party, Holman said, after he'd lost the 1920 election and his seat, should erect golden statues to its strange allies. Among these strange allies, Ley could count himself. Ley sought a position in cabinet, but never received it. As he had done to the Mayor of Hurstville Council and Varney Parkes, Ley began to cause trouble for Holman when things did not go his way. Ley proposed a system of proportional representation for New South Wales which, while forward-thinking in theory, resulted in a gross overrepresentation of rural New South Welshmen, and also the loss of Holman's seat. The system was eventually brought in after long delays, which saw Ley leave the Nationalists to join the Progressive Party, a precursor to the Country Party and not actually a progressive party in the social sense. Ley later described himself as a co-founder of the party, but the term early adopter is more appropriate. The Progressive Party came notionally into being in 1915, but it was not until a scandal involving wheat prices that saw a minister resign that the progressive movement gained traction, mainly in rural areas. In 1920, Ley contested the new 5-member district of St George for the Progressives. Dan Morgan proposes that the entire purpose of the proportional representation reform was to give Ley a bigger electorate to satisfy his egotism. He quotes Jack Lang as saying Ley wanted a federal-sized electorate to match his federal-sized ambitions. By expanding his influence in the St George area, Ley began laying the groundwork for his path to federal politics. It was not yet time for Ley to make the jump, however. The result of the 1920 election meant that Labour sat 3 seats short of a majority. If Labour supplied a Speaker, that would leave them controlling 44 votes on the floor of the Legislative Assembly, while the opposition and non-aligned crossbenchers would control 45. Holman, then still Premier while the new government was being determined, did it in his duty to recommend a new Premier to the Governor of New South Wales. It was not until Daniel Levy, a Nationalist MP and a friend of Ley's during his brief education, volunteered for the speakership to end the deadlock, allowing Labour to govern, as Peter Slipper would do 91 years later in the federal parliament. Like Slipper, Levy was berated and attacked by his colleagues for this perceived betrayal. Ley defended Levy, calling his attackers liars. Levy's support for the government as Speaker ended when contentious legislation saw him resign, which gave the Progressives, Nationalists and crossbenchers the opportunity to seize control of government. Nationalist George Fuller became Premier of New South Wales, but more importantly, Ley had finally acquired a cabinet position, becoming the Minister of Public Instruction and Minister of Labour and Industry. Though Ley, as a progressive member, supported the government, the majority of his colleagues originating from rural electorates did not. No less than 7 members of the Progressives declared their opposition to forming government with Fuller. Meanwhile, it emerged that Levy's resignation as Speaker was conditional on a non-nationalist member taking up the chair. When Nationalist MP William Bagnall nominated for the speakership, using his nomination speech to savage the treachery of Ley in his actions that tore down the Holman government, Levy reversed his resignation. The consequence of this was that, just as quickly as Fuller's ability to command confidence in the Legislative Assembly appeared, it vanished. Fuller went to the Governor, handed in the commission on which the ink had only so recently dried, and tried the only thing he could think of, which was calling for an election. The Governor refused. The bizarre episode concluded with Labour returning to the government benches, and the record of Fuller's 6-hour ministry remains the shortest in New South Wales history. The reprieve from chaos lasted a few months, until Labour's tenuous grip on power could remain no longer, and the government called for an election, which it lost decisively. Ley had struck at the Labour Party, using sectarian tensions, combined with lingering discontent from the conscription split, to accuse them of secretly trying to funnel money into Catholic schools. The accusation was unfounded, but it stuck in many Protestant minds by repeatedly emphasising the Irishness of the names of Jim Dooley and several other Labour ministers. Catholics were a minority in Dooley's cabinet, and Dooley was an Anglican. The Progressive Party split, as Ley led metropolitan members towards supporting Fuller, while rural members refused to enter a coalition with the Nationalists. These rural members would eventually come to form the Country Party, while Ley and his coalitionists rejoined the Nationalists. Ley's help did not go unrewarded, and when Fuller's government was sworn in, Ley became Minister for Justice, and served a lot longer than 6 hours. When Fuller handed Ley the justice portfolio, he entrusted him with the administration of the prison system, probation and parole services, the Registrar General's Department, the Coroner's Court, the Courts of Petty Sessions, the Marriage Act, and, to the rapture of the temperance movement, the Liquor Act. Ley had promised to call for an immediate referendum on prohibition if elected, and this promise created considerable energy from the temperance movement in support for his campaign, which would eventually result in him recording a vote of over 10,000, substantially more than the quota needed to elect him in his own right. Ley, having got what he needed from the temperance movement, waited until October 1923 before backflipping on his promise, instead declaring a plebiscite would be held in 1928, 5 years later. He was attacked by the temperance movement for this betrayal, as well as by the Labour Party. The McGirr brothers, still not over the leg incident, accused Ley of taking bribes from liquor interests. Ley countered these accusations with the weak argument that by giving the temperance movement time to prepare for the plebiscite, only then would they be able to win. Still, some believed Ley, and a divide formed within the temperance movement that would see its leader, Canon Robert Hammond, resign. This was the end of the temperance movement in New South Wales. The plebiscite was eventually held, and the anti-prohibitionists won resoundingly, with 71% of the vote going against prohibition. It was never confirmed whether Ley had taken money in this case. However, other instances of Ley taking money which influenced his decision-making existed, such as the approval of a development while he was on the Hurstville Council. As Minister for Justice, Ley gained a reputation for unbending adherence to the letter of the law, and a dislike for clemency. The most famous incident of this was the case of Edward Williams, who was found guilty but recommended for mercy by a jury after he had killed his 3 daughters. Ley would not commute his sentence, and Williams was hung at Long Bay Jail. In another case, a young English-born man named Leonard Puttifoot had killed a boy aged 5, though he had claimed he had mistook the boy for a girl and hadn't intended to kill him, but rather to lure him out of sight and commit an offence. In covering the boy's mouth to silence him, he had asphyxiated him. Puttifoot was sentenced to 3 years in jail for manslaughter rather than murder. This decision was reviled by the public, but Ley refused to intervene. He did, however, release Puttifoot halfway through his sentence in order to deport him, in the days before the state election, as a last act of political sabotage for the incoming Labour government. The new Labour Minister for Justice was able, thanks to dock strikes, to catch and re-imprison Puttifoot, who would serve the remainder of his sentence before being deported. The inaction of Ley, except in cases where there was a political advantage to be had, earned him many enemies across New South Wales. At this point, I must introduce a new character that was woven into the fabric of Thomas Ley's life. The Millions Club was an association dedicated to encouraging immigration to Australia from the United Kingdom. Ley's membership led him, in February 1921, to visit Western Australia, where he met Maggie Brooke while speaking to her family, who were English immigrants. Brooke's husband would die a year later, and Ley would house her in an apartment in Hunter Street, Sydney, pay her household expenses for many years, as well as giving her money to invest in property with. Though Ley was married, Brooke admitted later that she was having sex with Ley soon after her husband's death. Louisa, Ley's wife, would call Brooke a passing phase in her husband's life, declaring that she and Ley had always been devoted. Ley would bequeath his fortune to Louisa. She was aware of the affair by the time of Ley's ascent to cabinet, and was faced with a dilemma. Which would she sink, her husband's career or her pride? Her personal ambition to be the Prime Minister's wife, Morgan claims, outweighed her need for justice. She was a key member of his campaign team, using her connections to seek out the sick for postal voting or those on holiday for absent voting. Though Ley was described by his son as a model of discretion, people eventually started talking about his frequent visits to Maggie Brooke's home. The 1925 election brought Labour's Jack Lang in as Premier of New South Wales, after a strong swing against the government. The moment the final count was posted, Ley lost interest in state politics. He had tilled and sown Hurstville and Sutherland, and now was the time to reap and make the jump to federal politics. He would scarcely appear in the Legislative Assembly from then on. He burst back onto the political scene with the announcement that he was to contest the federal electorate that encompassed Hurstville, Barton. His opponent, Labour incumbent Frederick MacDonald, had been a school friend at the Sydney School of Arts in the 1890s. The spectre of the Puttifoot decision menaced Ley during the campaign, as the media and public frequently attacked him for the decision. In what was perhaps one of the earliest examples of political disinformation, Ley claimed at a rally that rumours had been circling that Puttifoot was the illegitimate son of his dead sister and a New Zealand knight, which he then claimed were false. Labor, which had been stoking claims about the Puddifoot affair as part of their campaign, were not game to call out Ley for making up such a fanciful rumour, and the discussion of the story relaxed. Morgan proposes that this was the first indicator of Ley's paranoia, which rendered him emotionally incapable of admitting a disagreeable criticism of himself could be true. He put himself in the dock, framed outlandish charges against himself, and handed the bewildered prosecution the impossible brief of sustaining them. Similar was the rumour that he concocted that he had been paid to release Puddifoot. Perhaps in desperation to get back on the front foot against Ley, MacDonald went out 4 days before the election and claimed Ley had offered him money to withdraw from the race. Ley sought legal action against him, whilst publicly declaring, as with all rumours against him, that they were nonsensical, and that he was sure that someone someday will make out a plausible case against him for murder. Ley's calculations were paying off. The allegation of bribery, held up with the other rumours about Ley, gave the appearance of a campaign of persecution, and the scepticism of the electorate was invoked. Election day arrived, and the result in Barton, as in many places across the country, was a strong swing to the Nationalist Party. The result was victory for Ley, with a margin of around 1,000 votes. He was the Honourable T.J. Ley, MHR at last. Since Federation, the Commonwealth Parliament had been his goal, and the Hurstville Council and the State House were his stepping stones. There now was only one more bridge to cross, and it reached from the House of Representatives' backbenches to the ministerial table. Prime Minister Stanley Bruce had endorsed Ley on the recommendation of the Nationalist Party's Sydney office. He had no personal knowledge of Ley. He did know of MacDonald, who in his estimation was trustworthy, certainly not capable of the unscrupulousness that Ley charged him with. Ley's associates in the New South Wales branch began clamouring for his election to Cabinet. Ley met with Bruce in Melbourne for 5 minutes and was not promoted to the ministry. Bruce promised a review of the decision in a few months, granted he was successful in his slander action against MacDonald. Exclusion from Cabinet was one thing, but MacDonald wasn't done yet going after Ley. He petitioned the Court of Disputed Returns, the court responsible for adjudicating election results, to render the Barton election void on account of Ley's bribery. The fat was in the fire now. Not only were Ley's seat in Parliament and his cabinet hopes in jeopardy, but even his liberty was at stake. Ley was a man so close to his goal, and with a lot to lose. He offered to call off his prosecution if MacDonald called off the petition, which MacDonald initially refused. MacDonald had been ill before the election, and his campaign against Ley had further weakened him. The financial cost of the action also weighed on his mind. MacDonald decided that it was best for his financial future and his health that he call off the case. Ley dispatched paperwork to MacDonald forthwith, and the Faustian document lay before him. Elements within Labor were hostile to MacDonald, and his future in politics was over, regardless of the decision he made that day. It was then that MacDonald's ancestral heritage torrented through him, and a streak of Scottish stubbornness had reasserted itself. Ley's offsider returned without a signature, and Ley would lodge a challenge in the High Court the next day, calling on MacDonald to show cause why his petition should not be thrown out. Reinvigorated, MacDonald sought a position within the Education Department, arranging a meeting with Premier Jack Lang, and was advised by Labor MLA Mark Gosling that he wasn't going to be disappointed. MacDonald concluded a lunch with his wife at 2:40 p.m. and walked towards Macquarie Street for his 3 p.m. meeting with Jack Lang. MacDonald would never be seen again. A media frenzy ensued, as calls for information for a man matching a description which might have matched 200 business or professional men at the area at that time were made. The public's information was as voluminous as it was inconclusive. A letter addressed to Jack Lang appeared a day later, in handwriting thought by some to be MacDonald's, which reiterated his claims against Ley, but also spoke of being on the verge of the grave, eternity. Morgan's analysis of the handwriting found graphological similarities between the letter and certain quirks of Ley's writing style, and John Adam of the Sydney Graphology Centre concurred with Morgan's findings. The attack on Ley's integrity threw people off the scent, as was the intent, Morgan contends. By attacking himself, he had the same effect as when he had fabricated rumours during the election campaign. His deviousness was beyond the ken of Gosling, Lang, and others who read it. They simply could not fathom his paranoiac cunning. The letter continues to break down alternative theories, having been dated more than a fortnight before the fateful afternoon. Morgan posits the following. If it was suicide, why was his outward appearance so cheery and hopeful, not to mention the lapse between the writing of the letter and the disappearance? If MacDonald left Australia, why bother with entertaining the notion of working at the Education Department? If it was murder, why bother predating the, in this hypothesis, forged letter at all? Morgan proposes that it was information warfare, adding confusion to an already confounding case. Ley had the means, with his experience in justice familiarising him with the sorts of people that would perpetrate such an act, and the motive, with MacDonald being all that stood between him and consideration of a cabinet. He had nearly made it, and he was not going to be stopped now. At the time, the idea that Lay could be responsible seemed a bridge too far. Later events gave credence to Morgan's theories. After MacDonald failed to appear at the Court of Disputed Returns, the court had no choice but to throw out the case against Lay. The saga had not, however, brought Bruce on side. In fact, he was more suspicious of Lay than ever, and would continue to refuse Lay's request for ministry. Perturbed but not hopeless, Lay struck out on his latest venture, SOS Prickly Pear Poisons Limited, a company which sought to sell poison to wipe out the scourge of prickly pears, an invasive species which blighted farmland. The company's founders included Lay and chemist R.C. Hammond, who had come upon a novel poison. Nationalist MPs and old colleagues of Lay, including MLA Hyman Goldstein, bought up shares in the company, after the new poison formula was reported to have recorded a 100% kill rate. At the first meeting of the company board, Lay's son Keith, the company secretary, announced a profit of £4,300 and announced an immediate payment of a dividend. Lay, having gotten his 5,000 shares of the company for free as a co-founder, sold them for £9,200, equivalent to 12 years on a parliamentary salary, and went on holiday. The company would go into liquidation a year later. A shareholder investigation, led by Hyman Goldstein, found that they had been conned. The poison that was supposedly selling like hotcakes was not only totally ineffective, but had not even been patented, as the request for patent had lapsed before completion. The profit of £4,300 that Keith Lay had announced was actually a loss of almost £1,000. During and after Lay's holiday around Asia and Europe, he was being hounded for answers by Goldstein, who would not cease in his quest for an explanation. He asked questions in Parliament as to whether the government intended to make reforms to safeguard investors, which the government did say they were looking at. Lay's return to Australia in 1928 was where the cracks that had formed since the disappearance of MacDonald began to fissure. His law partner resigned after the Poison Company affair, and in fact joined the shareholders and supported them in their aim of litigation against Lay and the company's directors. So, as so many politicians did, and indeed still do, he sought a way out of Parliament in Australia which involved him being handsomely remunerated, which came in the form of a vacancy in Geneva for a permanent Australian representative to the League of Nations. He repeatedly called on Bruce to allow a debate of the subject in Parliament, but was denied equally as repeatedly. Months later, to a near-empty House, Lay made his case, full of sound and fury signifying nothing. No media picked up his proposal for a permanent representative, nor did anyone in Cabinet care for it. He would later try to plant the story in the media that he was in line for the position, and was embarrassed again when Bruce denied it during question time. Lay was unhappy for some time, until the surprising death of the Minister for Customs, a New South Welshman, which would require a replacement from the same state. Lay was, or at least thought he was, back in the race. Lay boasted from one end of Barton to the other that he would be the new minister. Bruce put paid to the rumours of a cabinet assent for Lay a few days later, citing the ongoing case with the Poison Company. Bruce appointed himself to the ministry. Far from perceiving the liability for the party that he would have been in cabinet, Lay believed Bruce had kept him out only because he was concerned that Lay was a threat to his position as Prime Minister. Only a lunatic could have failed to grasp that fact, and that lunatic was Lay. Once again, the actions of one man, Hyman Goldstein, and his investigations had withheld Lay from his rightful position in a ministry. While most Nationalist MPs who had been stung by Lay resented him for it, it was only Goldstein who was willing to drag the party, in an election year, into conflict and disunity. While the Conservative press would have nothing to do with it, Goldstein leaked information to the Labour Daily. At the Supreme Court of New South Wales, Lay was called to answer the first case of misrepresentation to two shareholders, with Goldstein the principal witness. When the first day of the trial came, Goldstein did not appear. 18 days prior, his body had been found at the bottom of a cliff by his home in Coogee. In the court case, he was described as having been under stress and a sleepwalker, but not the kind to kill himself without writing a letter. The fact that Goldstein's glasses were not recovered pointed toward the death being accidental, as he had poor eyesight, but his brother described him as a methodical man, and given he had put on a coat to keep warm on his walk, the decision to go without his glasses seems strange. It isn't possible to link Lay to the death, but it matches Lay's style, removing people who get in his way. Another litigant, Keith Greedor, would die after falling overboard on a boat to Newcastle. The result of the court case was a settlement, and many shareholders began to take action against Lay. Many more private settlements occurred, with the costs in resolving the disputes having cost Lay between £12,000 and £14,000. Putting him quite substantially in the red and forcing him to sell some assets, including his home in Hurstville. Lay had 2 months to cleanse himself of the scandal before the federal election of that year. his tenuous margin of 1% no great bulwark he had earned at the state level. Having sold his home, he was living 7 miles outside of the electorate's boundaries in a rented house in Bellevue Hill. Unfortunately, the Labor Daily's unending attacks on Lay's integrity, which no amount of deceit or disinformation could defend against, sunk him. Lay would suffer a 7% swing, around 3 times the average swing against the government at the election of that year. Lay's defeat not only left him without income, but nationalists whom he had deceived with the poison company that were holding off on taking action against him now had no issue of party loyalty to contend with. Lay was being harried also by tradesmen over bills he had run up during his campaign. Printers were demanding payment for posters and pamphlets, motor hire companies were pestering him with accounts for cars and drivers he'd engaged, and there were charges still outstanding for the hire of halls and amplifiers and for cinema advertising slides. Lay was in a corner, and the only way for him to win was not to play. Leaving his wife but taking his mistress, Maggie Brooke, he left Australia forever and set sail for England. Lay arrived on the scene in London with almost nothing to his name. He made his new start with financial support from Brooke, who funded his purchasing of several properties in London and establishment of a company concerned with the sale of property. He was also, through connections he had made in an earlier trip to Geneva, able to join the founding of a gambling syndicate, which he helped to find a home for in Danzig, Poland. Lay became a key player in the syndicate, and had to be consulted in all matters, however trivial. He would eventually leave the company, but not before getting back to his old tricks, defrauding investors by lying about the state of the company and getting out with a small fortune. His account books were burnt, as the police were making things extremely awkward. There were more instances of Lay's poor business practices, especially in property interests. A forged document saw his son Keith imprisoned for 3 years, and Lay was convicted for engaging in black marketeering during the war. The Lays frequently moved house and found themselves at 5 Beaufort Gardens in Knightsbridge. Brooke's daughter and son-in-law lived 8 miles away in Wimbledon, where they lived in a building with a barman named John Moody. On an occasion where Brooke was visiting her daughter, she happened to briefly converse with Moody. This brief encounter led Lay to astonishingly plague himself with the notion that Moody and Brooke were having an affair, despite Brooke being 30 years Moody's senior. He also believed Brooke was having an affair with her son-in-law. On the 30th of November 1946, Moody's body was discovered, having been strangulated and dumped in a chalk pit. A long saga of derangement and fantasy led up to the killing. Lay had imagined that Moody was extorting Brooke for funds to open his own pub. He recruited a wrestler named Buckingham, and a foreman who had been doing renovations for him named Smith, and explained his deluded version of the situation and what he wanted from them. He proposed that he would bait Moody to his home with a woman, Mrs. Bruce. The 2 men would then restrain him, and Lay would pay him £500 to leave the country. He had no such intention. The day came, and Buckingham left at 7 p.m, seeing Moody arrested but alive. Smith would be heard returning home at 11 p.m. The ropes originally intended to restrain Moody were used to strangle him, and his body was driven to the chalk pit and dumped. News of the murder reached Mrs. Bruce, who had been assured the mission was legal by Buckingham. The 2 came forward and told Scotland Yard what they knew. The police uncovered the porter who had connected Lay with Buckingham. Armed with the evidence they needed, they confronted Lay, who would deny involvement categorically, and held this position throughout the investigation and subsequent trial. Unlike his enemies in New South Wales, who came to untimely ends, there was an undeniable trail that led back to Buckingham, Smith and Lay. In court, Lay gave the appearance of an uninterested executive at a board meeting. An hour's deliberation produced a guilty verdict, and Lay was sentenced to death. 3 days prior to the hanging, the Home Secretary ordered that, on account of Lay's mental infirmity, the sentence should be commuted, and Lay should reside in Broadmoor Criminal Lunatic Asylum. On the 24th of July 1947, 4 months after his internment began at Broadmoor, Thomas John Lay died, aged 66.
Soft, pink and weak, foot and thigh, tongue and cheek. You know I'm told they swallow you whole, skin and bone. Cutting boards and hanging hooks, bloody lies. shoot.